Connecticut and Massachusetts, Z&M Homes buys houses. Sell your property to the local guys.
Needs repairs, updates, maybe foreclosure or inherited? No problem. We gotcha. Google or add us on Facebook at ZANDMHomes.com.
It's Baxie's musical podcast.
Drugs and music have always had this strange and toxic relationship with each other. On one hand, you've had some of the greatest songs in history inspired by it, and then on the other hand, it's destructive and unforgiving. In other words, the very stuff that has inspired the greatest rock and roll songs in the world is the very same thing that can take it all away. It's as if the emotional vulnerabilities that allow someone to find solace in making music can also be the same toxic stuff that can feed the disease of addiction, making some feel they can't have one without the other. Unfortunately, far too many people have succumbed to their abuses and have never been able to find their way out. And throughout music history, there has been this dangerous tendency to romanticize these tragedies, as if these self-destructive legacies were somehow enhanced by the drugs that would eventually rob them of their talent, their abilities, and their ambitions. But it's even more insidious than that, because these same addictions can also have the ability to rob people of their families, their friends, their support systems, and sometimes their willingness to seek help. What we sometimes fail to fully understand are these legends are also human beings who are suffering from the same insecurities, traumas, and pain that many of us often feel. Combine that with the need to self-medicate with the drugs and alcohol that many of us consume, eventually consumes the ones who are most at risk, and you don't have to be a rock star to get there. In 1991, guitarist Johnny Thunders, formerly of the New York Dolls, died in New Orleans at the age of 38 under mysterious circumstances. Some will tell you that he was robbed and then murdered for drug money. Some will say he died from an overdose. Others will tell you that he lost his battle with leukemia. Whatever the truth might be or might have been, there's no dispute that Johnny Thunders was both driven and consumed by his demons. Whatever the circumstances might have been, Johnny Thunders and his musical legacy have been partially clouded by the grip of his addictions. And his reputation for that was at times well-earned. But this was a guy who was part of two of the most influential bands in history, the New York Dolls and the band he would form with former New York Dolls drummer Jerry Nolan, known as the Heartbreakers, a band whose one and only album is still considered to be a punk rock classic. In both cases, these two bands crumbled before anyone would have a chance to discover their greatness. Even his solo work, that seemed to have so much promise, would eventually follow suit. In particular, his amazing 1978 solo album, So Alone, featuring the brilliant track, You Can't Put Your Arms Around a Memory. And it's a terrible shame, because had it not been for the drugs and the erratic and often unreliable behavior that followed, Johnny Thunders would have been granted the respect and admiration that his talent deserved. Unfortunately, he was often his own worst enemy, which resulted in his reputation obscuring the promise of what might have been. In 1987, writer Nina Antonia wrote the definitive, completely authorized biography of Johnny Thunders' life. The book was entitled Johnny Thunders, In Cold Blood. It's a book that takes a look at not only the addictions that fueled his life, but also looks at the life that led up to them. Nina was not only a fan of Johnny Thunders, she got to know him personally. And the book, which now has been reissued by Jawbone Press, offers an unapologetic glimpse into a man whose legacy is profoundly and undeniably misunderstood. This is my conversation with rock biographer Nina Antonia on Baxie's musical podcast. So I spent a good deal of time reading the book, Johnny Thunders in Cold Blood. I absolutely loved it. But, the truth is that I'm reading it, I'm thinking, well, you could very easily have written the story of Sylvain or Johansson or Arthur Kane. What was it about Johnny Thunders that drew you to write the story about him?
Yeah, because they were all interesting characters with great background stories. But I mean, I felt out of all of them, Johnny was the essence of rock and roll. He was a very exciting performer, a great dandy. I felt like he had a mythos already attached to him. he was like somebody who was 24/7 in a film. And although I briefly met Johansson and I met Sylvain and everything, they were, well, Johansson, obviously, Scorsese's picked up on him.
Right.
They were all unusual, colorful characters, but for me, it was Johnny that had the charisma.
I think whenever I read things about Johnny, and I think what's so telling about it is, and apart from your book, there's this immediate fixation on the drug addiction alone, and I think that what gets lost in that discussion is the influence that he had, and what the Dolls had on music and culture. To me, I think you agree, that's where the bigger story lies. Is if no one can tell the story both ways, but you did. Tell me about that. Do you think that he has been fairly reported on, or that story has been fairly reported during the last 50 years?
No, I think that one of the problems is that the internet has opened the floodgates to people who aren't professional journalists and just go ahead and say whatever they want. They don't do their research properly. They don't sit down and read the book or watch Danny Garcia's film. And they like to, I mean, all of our culture is about making everything as exciting and sleazy as possible, but we lose the truth in that.
I think he did a really great job of addressing both aspects of his life. I mean, there's a lot of different wheels in motion here, without any condemnation or dismissiveness like you would read in, I mean, not just online, but even in magazines back, even when he was still alive in the 80s and maybe even early 90s. I think most people had a really hard time separating the legacy from the reality of the guy, and you were able to kind of see through that and offer, actually, I think, a very fair portrayal of what Johnny Thunders was all about. It's not just that he was addicted to drugs, but that there were so many different layers to his story. How do you respond to that?
I mean, I think it's because the book grew up with me, and I learned to write in a nuanced way. And unless you have a seasoned writer writing about certain things, then it will come out as kind of this flatline obsession with the drugs. And then there's nothing else. But that wasn't the total of Johnny's story. Hang on, it was more like that he managed to keep going despite his addiction.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think that's, part of the beauty of the story. I mean, here's a guy who had, significant issues, but, here he is also writing these, these iconic anthems throughout his career, whether it's with the New York Dolls, the Heartbreakers, or even his solo work. I mean, there's clearly a complexity about who he was.
Well, I was going to say he was a very wounded person, and unfortunately, as we've seen over and over again, say with Kurt Cobain, wounded people sometimes self-medicate, and even though that ends up being their downfall, that's how they try and manage life.
You got a chance to know Johnny while you were compiling the book, and you certainly talk about meeting him in the book and getting to understand him. When you did meet him for the first time, what were your impressions of him? Did he? I mean, you talked about how he seemed maybe a little bit distant early on, but once you started to crack that, what did you learn about him right away?
Well, I mean, I've just to go back to that. The first time I met him was in Soho in a pub, and I couldn't speak for the first 15, 20 minutes because he was like my hero. I just like silent. I was like, oh God, I can't move. And also he, as I say, he was very charismatic. He was there with his German manager. But what I also realized very quickly is that actually he was quite shy when he wasn't being the Johnny Thunders persona, and he was just being himself, who was John Anthony Genzale. He actually was quite shy. And we eventually, it was Alan Hauser from Jungle Records was there as well. So he and Johnny's manager got into conversation, and Johnny and I got into conversation. And I think he said, if you're going to do this, I just want you to observe everything that's going on with me. I guess, and I can't remember how he phrased it. He said, I just don't like talking about it too much, but I want you to be the, chronicling it. He may not have used those exact words, but that's what he implied.
That's pretty trusting of him. He must have sensed something in you that made him feel comfortable allowing you to do that. I mean, this was your first book, and you were in his mind probably just a fan, but there must have been something about that relationship between the two of you that made it comfortable for him to allow you to do this.
Well, I mean, the manuscript of the book had gone through Alan at Jungle, and then it had gone on to Johnny's manager. So he was kind of protected anyway. But I also think that had I been a really hard-ass professional male journalist, then it would have happened. It would have backfired. I think it was my naivety that kind of peeled, you know? I wasn't a hustler or anything. And I didn't write for a big scary paper, so Johnny could relax.
There's an interesting part of the book where you talk about how you become familiar with the New York Dolls. And I look at that in terms of, well, how did Americans get to know about the New York Dolls? And most Americans didn't at the time. But in Great Britain, it was different. I mean, I think there was probably more passion for the New York Dolls than there was here in their own country. I mean, they simply did not fly in certain areas of our country.
It was the big Midwest that didn't get the dolls. The dolls were, absolutely loved in Los Angeles and New York, all the capital cities, Philadelphia. Everybody went crazy for them. But outside of that, they couldn't. The mothers of Memphis wanted them arrested and not to have them play. So I don't think it's strictly true. I would say that they were as loved in capital cities as they were in England or in London.
You became aware of them by viewing them in 16 magazine, which I mean, I remember the magazine, but it seems strange to me that magazine targeted to teenage girls would have been where you would have spotted them for the very first time. Tell me about your first impressions just looking at what the band was about.
I have to speak for 16 magazine because Lee Black Childers, who managed the Heartbreakers, 16 magazine had an energy to it. Lee Black Childers took pictures, and they did used to be quite an interesting magazine. I think they featured Jim Morrison in his fur coat. Do you remember that? And that caused a huge outrage. And that was 16 magazine.
I guess for me, 16 magazine wouldn't have been my first thought of trying to find out and discover new bands. And I guess and
David Cassidy and John Osmond and all of that. But somewhere within that mix, somebody at the wheel saying, let's do something a bit different here every now and again. So God bless 16 magazine. I think of it fondly forever.
I watched the Bob Harris video, the Old Grade Whistle Test, and his reaction after they're done. But it was to call them mock rock. And as dismissive as it was, I think ultimately the band had the last laugh on that. I mean, how many kids in the UK were inspired by that specific performance, and especially by Bob Harris's reaction to it? I mean, to me, it had to be a countless number of kids that were just like kind of snapping back at Bob Harris on that.
Oh, I mean, poor Bob Harris. He lived to regret that, but I think he also captured a moment in time where the old guard suddenly fell and it was time for the new guard in his pronunciation of them as mock rock.
Yeah.
And as you probably read, I mean, Morrissey saw it, Paul Cook saw it from the Sex Pistols, and Mick Jones and Joe Strummer from the Clash saw that. We were all wide awake and watching. And it was this epiphany. It's like, oh, we've seen this vision, now we know. They were a vision. And I think if you watch it back again, they all move in these different, really strange ways. And I see bands doing that now, almost copying them. We don't take that for granted. You know what I mean? The bands in the past, even with the Stones, everybody aside from the front man stays relatively still. Isn't that way with the Dolls? They're all moving and they're all very, great to watch. Arthur, 6 foot tall in his, thigh-high blue paint and leather boots. I mean, he's fantastic. The only living statue in rock and roll was how David Johansen described him.
I think one of the things that people have a hard time really grasping by today's standards, the New York Dolls would not be seen as that shocking. But in 1972, 73, it was a really big deal. 50 years ago, I mean, this was pretty scandalous to see a grown man, wearing a dress. And some stores and radio stations refused to carry the
That's
album
right.
or play the singles just based on the cover art alone. And it's interesting that, 2 years later, David Bowie would emerge kind of doing the same thing and yet would be treated as a mainstream artist.
Well, I mean, Bowie came to see the New York Dolls, and I think Sylvain said, and then he started going to the same person that made our shoes. So he saw the Dolls. Bowie was very good at taking influences, and he had a relationship with a brief fling with Serinda Fox, who was David Johansen's girlfriend, and Andrew Bowie had a little flirtation with Billy Mercier, who was the Dolls' first drummer. So it was all, yeah, he assessed them. There's some great pictures of him, I think, sitting at the back of Max's Kansas City watching them, and he looks like a kind of parakeet staring at them, thinking, oh, this is interesting.
There's a great section in the book which I really found really interesting, and I'm not sure I fully understand why they did this, but at the end of the New York Dolls, they get involved with Malcolm McLaren. The second album comes out. It's not that great. And then Johnny and Jerry leave the band. And I think probably for fairly good reasons at that point. But yet they get blamed for breaking up the band. But the band by that point is really already broken and had been for a while. My question is, why did they get involved with Malcolm McLaren in
it was
the
the other
first
way
place?
around, though. It was Malcolm McLaren got involved with them. He was a huge Dolls fan. He even followed them to Paris. He was and did design some clothes after seeing them. I mean, girls' underwear with fake fur on them and things. And I think at that point they were desperate. And McLaren was good at selling things. He would have said, well, let's try one last thing, guys. And that was to dress them in red leather and put a hammer and sickle flag up behind them, which Serinda Fox sewed. And it wasn't a great look, really.
Yeah.
Probably because the Vietnam War was still going on. It was, and then they went to do this Outback tour, which always reminds me of that bit in the Blues Brothers, where they're playing behind chicken wire.
Yes.
And the band eventually fall apart in this cinematic setting of a broken down trailer park that was owned by Jerry Nolan's stepdad. So it can't get more bleak and surreal than that. And they were having fried chicken. I love the details that they were having fried chicken and mashed potatoes. And I can imagine David Johansen waving a drumstick in the air, and he said the words, "Anybody can be replaceable." And at that point, Johnny and Jerry got on a plane, and people saying, "Oh, it's for the drugs and all the rest of it." But they probably had enough by then. And the red leather was, if somebody let me see a pair of those red leather trousers, they had some, and the leather was like rubber strength factory stuff. It would have been excruciating to wear in swamp weather.
To me, one of the most amazing stories to come out of the New York Dolls, and it was recounted in that documentary, New York Doll: The Story of Arthur Kane. It's one of the best rock documentaries I've ever seen. I mean, this poor guy had such a hard time after
it's such a moving film. It always makes me cry.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
He had such a hard time after the breakup, and that by the time that 2004 reunion came out, it was such a validating experience for him, and to know that he was as sick as he was and died very soon after that. What an amazing story.
Oh, he was so excited because we used to correspond via email, and not for that long. Because I wrote a book about the New York Dolls, and he enjoyed sort of telling those times to me. But we did email back and forth, and he was just so excited when he heard about the reunion. He was going, "I don't know what to wear. Should I wear polka dots? Should I wear pink? Blah blah blah." Oh, it's just really delightful to see him that happy.
And he was in the early stages of maybe writing his own story too, but it never. Obviously, he died long before he could ever finish that project.
Well,
which is
hang
kind
on,
of a shame.
because he was sending me extracts from it, and it was very, very good. And I tried to get him an agent. I failed. I mean, this is so awful. I failed. And what happened was that a book did come out, and it was very, very edited.
By the time Johnny and Jerry leave and they form the Heartbreakers with Richard Hell, they had built up this terrible reputation. But the reality is, when the Heartbreakers were together, they were arguably maybe one of the best bands in New York at the time, and it took an eternity for record companies to take a chance on them simply because of that reputation. It wasn't entirely undeserved by that point.
They were also up against people who thought that they'd had their chance with the Dolls and they'd blown it. So there was envy there as well. And Punk magazine, which was great, deliberately limited how many times they put Johnny in there because they thought he was a bad influence, and yet they put in Dee Dee Ramone and Iggy Pop. So there was a little bit of backstabbing going on there, but that's primarily why they came over to England, but also because Malcolm McLaren asked them. So Malcolm McLaren is important to the Dolls story.
There's this codependent relationship that exists between Johnny and Jerry Nolan, and you see that throughout the book. At its core, it's somewhat a toxic relationship, and it's fueled by both of their addictions, but primarily this dominance that Jerry seemed to have over Johnny. What was your thoughts about that relationship? I mean, is that an accurate assessment, or is that off?
It's relatively true, but I mean, I think Johnny needed a father figure, and he was quite emotionally volatile, and Jerry would have seemed like that father figure, the wiser, older person. They did care very much for each other. Jerry, to some degree, had to rely on Johnny keeping it together so he would get to play as well. And there's one gig, I think, in Los Angeles that was filmed, and I believe that Johnny made a promise not to take any coke and be a good boy before this quite big gig. And he comes out and he's not doing too well, and you can see the disappointment in Jerry's eyes.
Ultimately, what you read in the book, though, was that Johnny was very much an insecure young man. And he had lost relationships with his wife and children, and those were really painful losses for him. And then, at the same time, his health is declining, not just with drugs, but also with the leukemia as well. And in some respects, it's amazing that he was able to, record things as great as So Alone in 1970. It's such a brilliant record. It's just, like you said, he was able to overcome so much musically in spite of the challenges that he had. Do you feel like he felt like the drugs were getting in his way? Did he ever really explain that to you?
What he did, I mean, he says, I can in the book, I can play just as well on drugs as off them, but I do not use drugs, and he would have lived longer. But by the end of his life, he was definitely anti-drugs. He would say to younger people, "Do as I say, not as I do."
Johnny's death is a murky and unclear story. I mean, anywhere from dying from an overdose to being murdered or set up, or whatever it may have been, or that the leukemia may have killed him. What's your sense about what actually happened to him in New York? I mean, it's been a number of years since you originally released the book. Do you have any clearer sense of what may have happened, or is that always going to be somewhat of a mystery?
I've read the coroner's report. It indicates strongly that he had leukemia. He was very ill. There were drugs in his body, but it wasn't enough for him to overdose. Coroners always report any presence of drugs in the body, so he didn't overdose. My feeling is that, and he was robbed of his money as well, that people took advantage of his vulnerability. They ransacked the hotel room that he was in instead of calling an ambulance, and they just left him to die. What tragedy that there was nobody there to hold his hand.
Yeah, it's a terrible, tragic story, and a very sad part of the book where you just realize he was he was in such desperate need for help, and he needed someone to be there with him, and he was in a way, and I mean, no irony here, but he was just so alone in New Orleans. It's a very, very sad story.
Yeah, it's very sad because Jerry begged Johnny to go into hospital before he went and toured in Japan, and he said he'd go stay with him overnight as well. But Johnny was scared of hospitals because they don't always drug users well, especially not in America.
Again, the name of the book is Johnny Thunders in Cold Blood. It's a great, great book. Nina, I appreciate the time today. Best of luck with it. I hope it sells well. I know it's been a book that has been in great demand for a long time, so it's wonderful that it's now back out and available for people to buy and read through it again.
Thank you so very much. It was lovely talking to you.
Appreciate it, Nina. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. The name of Nina Antonia's book is called Johnny Thunders in Cold Blood, available from Jawbone Press. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to like it, share it, and let all your friends know about it. You can find updates and videos on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also email me at bax@rock102.com. I'd love to know what you think. Thanks to Z&M Home Buyers for their support, and thanks to you for listening to Baxie's Musical Podcast.